Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by John Jackson. It's great to have you back, John. How are you?
Yeah, good. Very well, thanks, Kieran. How you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Busy start to the year, but I suppose
Yeah,
that's teaching for you, education for you, isn't it?
yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's nice to kind of set aside a bit of time to talk about some teaching and some maths. So,
Well, that is the thing. Yeah, don't get reading. Like I say, I've always saying this the whole way through our previous three episodes. Don't get enough opportunities to read the fun stuff. And this is definitely one of those. I think
yeah,
we're gonna focus our attention on a paper called "What the Science of Learning Teaches Us About Arithmetic Fluency," and that's McNeil, Jordan, Viegut, and Ansari. So Daniel Ansari is probably the one that most listeners will be familiar with because I think Daniel did like some sort of we like not a sabbatical, but we spent time in a visiting university, and I'm pretty sure he was in the UK for a while before he went back to Tennessee, Canada, or whatever, whichever part of the United States he might be from. I don't know, continental United States.
yeah, yeah. I think McNeil is involved in the Fife et al. Paper that we talked about a while back about concreteness fading as well. So,
Oh, nice bit of symmetry. What the science of learning teaches us about arithmetic fluency. What's the paper about, John, and why is it useful?
I think the kind of overall thrust of the paper is it like looks at kind of one of the like core goals for early maths, like just sort of 2 to 7 in their kind of view, I think, which is building arithmetic fluency, that kind of like being able to use arithmetic. Basically, they're not saying this is all of early maths, but they're saying it's like a really crucial part of it, and they talk about like they recommend a mixed approach that like teachers should early maths should focus on like both the kind of recall of facts but also on meaning, and that's the kind of thing you hear quite a lot about. But I think what makes this useful is that they actually make good recommendations around that. So they give concrete descriptions of what that mixed approach might look like. um, they think about what teachers might do to like promote memorization and meaning and why they might do that as well. And then they also, and we might talk about this a bit later, like talk about potential pitfalls of those approaches. And then it's quite a chunky paper, but I think it's worth being the size it is because it starts with sort of an overview into the research around learning and development of arithmetic fluency, and that means that like not only their recommendations sort of evidence informed, but they like explain the reasons behind that. They sort of show they're working out basically, which should help people apply them like more flexibly rather than just sort of here's a rule I've got to follow. And then the thing I think that I find really interesting, like early maths obviously isn't my specialism as a secondary teacher. Like I'm kind of focusing much more on like that maintaining and developing that fluency as pupils are a bit older. But I found this useful because it shows you where that starts from. And while that might be like more familiar ground for like primary teachers, I think there's also some really good things around like what parents might do when they're working with children, and like some really like simple kind of conversational things almost that parents can do and like look for in children. So yeah, I think that's kind of a summary of why I think it's really useful.
You mentioned the fact that we're always hearing about it's not one or the other. It's a combination. And basically everything we talk about, it's that nuance, isn't it? But there's a quote from the NCTM, not to be confused with the NCETM, who, I'm not going to say they're bad faith actors, but there's very little to convince me that they're actually good faith actors because everything they publish is behind the paywall, which is annoying. And they're also making these scandalous statements like they're opposed to the memorization of arithmetic facts and the use of timed practice, and as recently as 2023. And then when I saw that, I was like, oh my goodness, you don't think this should be necessary, but there's clearly a substantial amount of people who are going about their daily business believing that memorization and timed, practice are a bad thing, and so why is this paper useful? I think it makes a really good outline of why the NCTM, the NCTM is wrong. Yeah, please don't. The National Centre of Excellence in Teaching Mathematics. Please don't I think I'm aiming this at you guys, but yeah, like I said, I don't want to say they're bad faith actors, but it's not good faith they're acting in here, is it?
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, obviously we're both based in the UK, but it seems like the position is much more polarized in the US, and um, I think where everyone over here will try and look for kind of common ground, and like, okay, well, there might be different positions and things, like there's bits around like how memory works and like the importance of like having stuff that you can recall from long-term memory easily is really well established by kind of everyone over here, like, and there might be like differences of opinion about exactly how you get there or what the research is saying about how you get there, but that importance of like knowing those facts um, is, I think, just much better agreed upon. And I think it's kind of interesting to see it set out in the paper in terms of how different that piece is, because I think, and what I think is really good about the paper is it talks a bit about how you might get there, because like that statement, like you need to memorize some facts, is just doesn't have any context, right? It doesn't tell you like, okay, well, is it just recall without anything else, or is it like that just happens organically? And actually, what the paper sort of takes you through is like what you need, those conversations and those representations and so on with meaning, and you also need to like explicitly practice it, and like with things like retrieval and things like that. And I think that's where it's kind of apart from those. Like often you hear that kind of, oh, we need a middle ground, but it doesn't say what that middle ground is, and this kind of sets it out quite clearly and bases it in like cognitive science and like educational research.
Really strange too, given that most of this research has been conducted in the United States of America, or certainly North America in general. But I suppose that's the same for cognitive science in general, isn't it? The Yorks get a lot more respect over here than they perhaps do in their own backyard. How do the authors describe arithmetic fluency, and what are the main recommendations?
They kind of they and this is the thing I like. They like set out the position nicely. They don't just like use the word and fail to define it. They sort of say like arithmetic fluency is like efficient, accurate, and relatively effortless mental production of sums and products of the numbers 0 through 10 and their inverses, which is a kind of slightly like very precise but like slightly clumsy way of saying like knowing your times tables and addition and subtraction facts. Um, but they're explicit that like has to include meaning, and it's not just like constantly quizzing pupils on just solving the same sort of questions again and again and again. And then they talk about approaching that and like kind of building that fluency in sort of, I think, sort of four main ways, really. Like the importance of having like a really enriching early environment for like almost before children are in school. Then explicit instruction about like around arithmetic, and that's again both like what the facts are and like making meaning out of them, and well structured retrieval, and then sort of appropriately using time constraints. The last one's probably the most unusual, sort of, well, not unusual, but I think the others are kind of fairly obvious, although they explain them really well. But maybe we'll kind of talk about them sort of in general. I think the like um, enriching early environment piece is just, it sort of explains what the early, most of the papers around explaining what the kind of early development of like mathematical thinking and numeracy is involved, so sort of like subitizing and conceptual subitizing and things like that, and the kind of different principles around like counting, which I think are things that will be really, really familiar to like primary school teachers, less so to secondary school teachers, I think. But it makes the point really well that like that stuff that happens before kids arrive in school matters, and particularly like just things like that parents at home can be like constantly trying to count things, or like explaining what the maths they're sort of using is in sort of everyday life, and yeah, saying okay, if I've got two and I want three, how many more do I need, and that kind of thing. And I think what I liked about that was it's sort of it's quite reassuring. I think it's not like if you were presented with that as a parent, it's not, oh my god, I need to learn a whole new way of thinking, or I need to be doing like maths practice every day. All I need to do is a bit of counting, and just think about it and listen to what my child is saying and like what that might be telling me about what they understand. So I thought that was kind of nice kind of clear point.
But that's one of the things you quickly realize when you join an earlier setting or a primary school, is that the children who are spoken to from a young age are the children who excel, and quite often it's the children of teachers who excel the most because they're having those really rich conversations, board games. You mentioned, the, bringing that mathematics into your daily life, only small tweaks to board games. I don't want you to count the number of pips on the dice, or I want you to touch the pips as you count them. I remember doing this with my kids, mostly during the pandemic, because that's when they were sort of at that stage. But it's just like small tweaks to things that you hopefully already be doing. I know board games aren't as popular as they used to be, but they definitely should be, because it's a game changer socially. And then those are the kids who are advantaged. I think was experientially privileged, as I describe it, when they went to school, because then they're the kids who are 18 months ahead of the kids who aren't.
Yeah, for sure. And you get all that like turn taking, socializing bit as well at the same time. Um, yeah, it's like nice. I think I was getting a train sort of a week or so after I'd read this paper the first time, and there were like a family playing a board game on the train. And your kind of attention's drawn to it because that's what you've just read, and you're kind of listening out and you're hearing them like count out the steps. You're like, oh yeah, okay, I can really see how this is, gonna really help their sort of development, things like that. So that's the kind of initial recommendation, and then they talk quite a lot about like explicit instruction and like really breaking down the elements of arithmetic fluency. So like providing models and practice, and particularly around that is sort of like using more efficient strategies for calculation. Which again, like stuff that primary school teachers like really know, but I like the kind of like systematic approach to this, and just I guess reinforce. It's always quite nice as a teacher to like hear reinforced like something that what you think is good practice is actually also reinforced by the kind of empirical evidence as well. So they talk about things like using 10 as a reference point for calculating 9 plus 5. So you might calculate 10 plus 5 and subtract 1, or write 9 plus 5 is 9 plus 1 plus 4, or all these kind of different things. And similarly for like multiplication, when they're kind of getting a bit older, like 9 times 5 is like 5 less than 10 times 5. Because they cite research that shows that like some pupils will figure out those alternative strategies and efficient strategies, but many don't, and will just carry on relying on the same things again, like relying on counting on, or and I definitely see this latter one, like at secondary school, like imagining the column method in your head, rather than kind of having that practice over time at the different ways of solving mental calculation problems. It breaks that down really nicely. Again, it's like stuff that primary school teachers know, but like reinforcing it and emphasizing it's part of like connected understanding. It's not just like, okay, we're going to learn this method, right now practice doing all these questions using this method or whatever it is, and that like doing that well is likely to involve some like pictorial or concrete representations, like things like particularly that kind of bridging 10, or where you're comparing to 10 lots of something when you've got multiplication. That understanding is so much clearer and so much more flexible when you've got those representations. Like definitely, I mean, I'm sure this happens at primary school as well, and like where kids have got the kind of, they can relate that concept, that they can then like extend it, so they can think about like adding or subtracting 99 and 999 and so on. And the ones who've just kind of like tried to then memorize the strategy in isolation are kind of stuck on just that one point.
Is that almost like when they describe the input and the output? Because obviously, at its most fundamental, that output of those known facts or those common facts. But there was a discussion of the input element too, where actually that's what takes this beyond the mere recitation of facts towards the development of, they use numeracy, they use number sense. They said there are lots of ways that academics have tried to describe the same fundamental ideas. Just understanding these sort of connections really, really well. And is that sort of what you see those inputs leading to, or is that what they are?
Yeah, I think so. I think they talked about this idea in a couple of different places, didn't they? So they talked about, um, yeah, that even if your goal might be to be able to like, yeah, add nine to a bunch of numbers or something like that, but actually you can't just skip straight to that, or you're going to get very like shallow understanding if you skip straight to that. And there's like understanding what's going on sort of acts as the bridge and reinforces those connections, and it makes it easier to like get that recall really well cemented, because there's a kind of meaningful sort of network of knowledge in your head, rather than you're just trying to like search for like it's nines, like what do I do with nines, like you've kind of got the kind of greater reliant different bits of cues and so on there. I can't remember if this is the point exactly they made in there, but it's sort of a related idea they talked about, which I think is kind of nice in maths, is that you quite often start off with learning about a concept as a process. So like, and then it becomes like an object. So like addition to begin with is kind of about the process of counting on, and then like addition is a separate thing. And the first time I ever came across this was around like fractions. Like initially, like a half or a quarter or three quarters or whatever is always like a half of something or a quarter of something or three. And then eventually those things become numbers, and then you can operate on them as numbers. And it's the same way, even way up to like A-level maths, because you have like differentiation as part of calculus is initially like a thing you do, and it like to something, and then it becomes like the derivative that like is a thing you can operate on and do stuff with. It's quite a like powerful way of just thinking about knowledge in maths, and I suppose that's sort of what's happening with the like going from the process to the outcome as well.
What might the risks of focusing arithmetic fluency be?
There's quite a few risks, and I think this is perhaps where the like let me get the right acronym, the NCTM, the American NCTM, are kind of approaching this from, in that you might end up with just that focus on like factual recall without meaning, and taken to kind of its not even taken to its extreme, but like when you have pupils that have just learned like maths in a really isolated and disconnected way, it just becomes so hard for them to kind of select the right bit at the right time, and to kind of hold it all in their heads. And it's the kind of thing that gets picked up in sort of curriculum reviews and like reviews of maths teaching, and like has been for my entire like teaching career of like 15 years, and has been for like probably 30-50 years before that as well. And I think the paper does a good job of like tackling that head on, because they're like sort of one of the big recommendations is around having like what they call well-structured retrieval practice. So having pupils continue to like practice recalling things they've learned from memory over time, and like for example, they might carry on practicing addition facts all the way through primary and probably onto secondary school as well. And they give a whole range of different ways that might happen. So like through quizzes and things like that, with the focus being like, as we kind of know about retrieval, and like your listeners will be really familiar with this, like recalling from memory, like with as little scaffolding as possible. And we know that works really well over time, particularly when spaced out, like much better than kind of restudying or repeating the information. But they talk about like that being much more impactful when it's well structured. So, and there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. And I think they're trying to get at two different things. They're trying to get at like having a systematic approach, so you're not missing stuff out, and also like leveraging those questions to sort of help build meaning and look for patterns. So whereas because you could do retrieval with things like dice games to like practice like addition packs or something like that, but they can be a bit like they can be really engaging. They've definitely got a place, but they can be really haphazard. You might never come across a fact, or like you might have your pupils who need the most practice with, I don't know, say using them for multiplication. They need loads of practice with their 3 times table, and it keeps giving them 7 times table questions, and it's not really helping. Um, so they suggest a few different ways of structuring it. Like they talked about, like starting with the easier ones. So like multiplication, you might start with multiples of 2 and then 10 and so on, and gain like confidence and momentum. Or starting with the hardest things. So you start with the things that are like 6 times 8 and 5 times 7. The thinking being that then you get the most practice at the hardest ones. Which is interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive to sort of maybe how you might approach it. Or like working with things that are foundational and then like getting derived facts from them. So again, if you start with sort of twos and like if you start with like twos and threes, you can then get your 6 times table and things like that, and you can make those links and make those connections. Um, but I think like, and then they talk quite a bit in terms of like potential risks. So I think the kind of two that like I think they really stress are like only focusing on that product, that outcome that we talked about earlier. Um, so yeah, lots and lots of kind of like quizzing, but they're not making those links to what the maths is behind it and this kind of structure. Um, and then the second thing is around like the importance of pupils like achieving success. So introducing that retrieval too early before they've really established that kind of knowledge, like sets would risk setting people's up to like fail or even like keep recalling the wrong fact, and sort of cement the wrong thing into their memory, which I think is something that sort of that kind of introducing that retrieval at the right time, um, is something that kind of links to one of their other recommendations around time constraints. And they kind of they again provide like quite nice specific recommendations about what they like about how to avoid introducing retrieval too early. They talk about like only introducing like 3 or 4 new facts at a time, and then only once they've got those like going on to some more, and then once they've got two sort of sets, then you can sort of start mixing them up and like really gradually building that in. So you're talking like a few minutes a day, not like chunks of like 20 minutes like once a week or anything like that. um yeah, so I think there are those kind of risks and pitfalls, and I think that's like what people worry about when they hear kind of like retrieval and memorization and things like that. But they give you some quite, they're kind of aware of those and suggest some quite like concrete ways of avoiding them. I imagine probably when we get onto time constraints, we'll talk about sort of the risk of maths anxiety and things like that as well.
Call them risks, but it's just things you should really be looking out for as a teacher anyway, because like they're called desirable difficulties for a reason, and I think what's really good is they explain how to make them desirable, like you said, by bringing in those small number of facts at a time and rotating them out and back in, but when I think about, things like, um, if pupils are misapplying strategies, haphazardly, well, that's just the same as looking out for overgeneralizations in the classroom that a teacher would be doing. So, I think possibly, they want to be helpful in supporting people in sort of taking that next step towards this kind of behavior in the classroom, but also maybe just felt like a need that because the discourse, like you say, is so polarized in their neck of the woods. We often find these with these kind of papers, sorry, any paper in the maths education field sphere, um, is that overcompensation, just to almost allay the fears of those who perhaps aren't, because I don't see anything on, like I said, I've got 9 things that I thought, potentially worth watching out for, that some of them they had mentioned, and it's stuff you're looking out for as a teacher anyway, I think, and so, I don't think it can be laid at, at the door of arithmetic fluency, because from what I could see, they've outlined this really effective way or what feels like a really effective way of getting pupils to the point where they're, like you said, confident with the mathematics. You think like John Starr, Riddle Johnson. What you were describing was adaptive expertise. And you do, in the same way the teachers don't become experts, in a sort of linear, seamless fashion. Same for the pupils too, but you want them to struggle. I mean, I agree. We don't want them to embed misconceptions, but they've got to see why things don't work as much as why they do work. And quite often in math, well, actually, that took a whole lot longer than I should have taken. If I just if I'd added 10 and subtracted one, that kind of thing. You think, oh well, look, I've got all this free time to do other stuff. That's
Yeah,
not
you
it.
kind of create the motivation for it almost by yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I think yeah, you part of it is like, oh yeah, you got to create the kind of worth the need for it, I suppose. Um, yeah, I think that kind of bit about struggling is quite nice in terms of um, they talk about like not restricting those question sets too much as well. So not having, I don't know, if you're suppose you're learning some multiplication facts in a like 3 times table or something, and not having them as all as like 3 times 3, 3 times 4, 3 times 5, mixing them so they're like something equals 3 times 5, or even like 3 times something equals 15, and so they're seeing all those different formats. And I guess there's also like the related sort of division facts in there, which again is like what we know is really good teaching, but often like resources don't support us with that. And when teachers are really time poor, it can be really like you don't even really have time to kind of notice it, let alone like act on it as well. But that kind of so hopefully this is a bit of a sort of I guess a call to arms to sort of policy and textbook makers as well.
So the authors talk about space drills, and this is the bit where the dun 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 in the background, like the pantomime body. What other low resource approaches might we use?
Yeah, I suppose before we just do that, like let's just like one of the things they do talk about is timed practice, um and this was something I wasn't quite so aware of the like research around. Actually, it was quite nice to read that um there's like some evidence that kind of those time constraints help improve performance, sort of there because your brain sort of like tries to meet the goal of doing things quicker and sort of works a bit harder. So, for example, if you kind of know how to count, like to add 9 and 5 by counting on, and you also know, but maybe you're not quite so like it's not your natural go-to like add 1 and then add 4 to do the same problem. Um, the time constraint can push you towards using that more efficient strategy. Um, but like they're really clear that you only want the time constraints when pupils are really like pretty fluent at it, like and pretty solid. Uh, because again, like things like maths anxiety, that little bit of time when you're quite good at something, a little bit of time constraint can create a tiny bit of like again a push to improve your performance. But if you're not any good at it to start with, it's going to be really stressful. It's going to make things worse. It's going to make you worry about your maths lessons. So it's definitely not like every maths lesson should have some time practice. It's definitely not like do time practice from the start or every day or anything like that. But like it kind of makes the case that it's quite a powerful thing to do in short kind of doses. And we're not talking about unrealistic time constraints either, like kind of reasonable and crucially not giving pupils the opportunity to compare their performance between each other, because then that sort of reinforces like I guess when we go back to what you talked about earlier with the pupils who get off to the best start are probably going to be in the best position to have that like um, to do that time practice even quicker, and then you're setting up unfair comparisons. It's not going to humans, we love comparing ourselves to each other even if it's not necessarily good for us. But yeah, the kind of question you asked was more about like what else might we use, and I think like elaboration is probably a really important one. So getting and that's a really good way of getting back to that kind of meaning making, which you probably do it more at the start, the kind of explicit instruction, and then pupils have practiced or whatever. But getting them to like explain why a strategy's worked, or explain why it's not worked, why it's not worked. Or it's kind of linked to that other paper we talked about a while ago, the Rittell-Johnson's paper, where it's comparing different methods, or why is this pupil done it this way and this pupil done it that way, and getting them to think and discuss and talk about what they're doing is really powerful for sort of improving that practice, and requires them to sort of retrieve from memory and things. And then I think we've already talked about that kind of varied practice. So they're not drills in all the same format. So you can vary that much more than the kind of what I talked about with just the movement of the position of the unknown and kind of the multiplication problem. And then I guess practice that supports connections, probably what you describe as variation theory. So I don't know, looking at a bunch of questions where you're adding 9 to different numbers, and then, well, okay, what do you notice about the number you started with and the number you finished with, or those kind of things can just make it a little bit more interesting. I think kind of what Craig Barton often describes as sort of purposeful practice. There's something else there as well as the sort of fluency building.
I don't know if you've heard the episode with Dan from who works in Cologne, and he was talking about I'll butcher the names, the Schwarzenvogel stress paper about raised cortisol levels during the encoding and the retrieval processes, and so it showed that actually a little bit slightly raised cortisol levels were actually beneficial for the learning process to take place. So I've often found any arguments against time practice to be ideological in nature. I won't obviously go near name anyone whose research or quote unquote research suggests that, because they can be quite litigious. But if we think about that element, I think it's not even mathematics. It's the natural sciences. It's how your body reacts, so it's a pretty good place. So if you haven't read that paper, I'll send it across to you, because it's meant to be seminal in that field. I'm not pretending to be a biologist in any shape or form, but it's really accessible. Elaboration you described there, I think, can often be something that gets missed. If we have a really good think, pair, share routine that works in tandem with our, whatever you want to call your my turn, your turn, our turn, I do, we do, whatever. If you have those two routines in place in a classroom, so you've got that back and forth between teacher and student, but also you've got every student in the class understanding the expectation that they're going to do a little bit of elaboration, at least a little bit. And if that gets built from when the children enter the school, when they enter reception, when they're in nursery, and they know what's expected, by the time they're, as they go through the school, you can tell the difference between students who are used to that kind of articulation and that kind of elaboration, because it comes naturally to them. Whereas when you're just learning, you're leaning on the mimicry of the teacher a little bit more, just like you would be during the my turn, your turn sort of phase. So whenever you mentioned that's what came to mind, was thinking about, as a subject leader, listening to this conversation and thinking, okay, what I should be trying to do is trying to tie all those different pieces together so that teachers know that they have all these different options, because you're not going to have, that purposeful practice in every lesson, because sometimes it's just going to be blocked, like you said before, block practice at the start. Let's get really good at doing this thing, and then we can maybe think about it later on. And so that I'm almost in the back of my mind trying to piece these things together, saying, how do we structure that? What do we call that? Or maybe someone already has. I don't know. I mean, would that be similar in if you're thinking about your classroom and your department, say you're head of department, are those the kind of things you're thinking your teachers are thinking about as well?
That idea of those core routines really enabling things is really powerful, and a nice kind of link back that you don't really need very many of them. There's a really good teacher education paper around kind of a modular approach being quite powerful in terms of thinking about teach. So you can think about, okay, well, if I can introduce an idea, that's an important thing to be able to do as a teacher, an I do, we do. If I can give them some practice, that's a really important thing to do as a teacher. And if I can get some kind of discussion, that's also a really important thing to do as a teacher. And I might do them, introduce the idea, discuss it, provide like practice. But I could also sometimes play around and go, oh, hang on, well, they know quite a lot about this. I'm going to give them something to have a go at. Then I'm going to get a bit of discussion, or then I'm going to teach them something about it. And then I'm going to like and play around with those different things. And if you've got those kind of initial routines really solid, that really sort of enables that. I think I am thinking about that. I am thinking about that at secondary. Like you are trying to get the same things. I think as a maths teacher, I think you want those kind of like building blocks that are like, I don't know, yeah, you can introduce some ideas, you can give some practice, you can check for understanding, and some techniques within that you'll use. But then you want some kind of like overall principles that you're sort of like can hang your decisions off as well. And then if you've got all of those things, then make you can make decisions in the classroom, and you can like plan and then adapt what you're doing. So I think it definitely kind of applies over at secondary as well.
Because if you're a teacher reading this, I think it could be really really useful because there's lots of really clear guidance on different just on the background itself, and then the ways that we might behave in the classroom. But I think what's clear, sort of having this conversation with you, John, is that when you're supported by systems in school, like say, for instance, the curriculum being really explicit and specific about which mental methods we're going to focus on, I think then you're almost in an advantageous position relative to your peers who have sort of got the standard calculation policy, but actually it's the same one that we had in 2000, and it's not really that explicit. It just mentions the grid method and that kind of thing, and and so I'm thinking that there are almost layers to this. As a teacher, you're reading this, you're thinking, well, if this support isn't here, or if this isn't the way we do things in school, I'm maybe thinking about where I'm going to apply my trade in the future, and that'll be something I'll look out for. But if I'm a leader, I'm thinking, okay, how can I help my teachers make this the reality for my pupils as much as possible? Because maybe because if you think about what other approaches, I think it's everything in tandem, and it's the relationship between curriculum and professional development, and almost asking ourselves what the pupil experience is, and then working from there. I think.
I think it is quite rich, kind of almost the more senior you are in this, and the kind of like from an audience point of view. I think as a school leader, you can think as a head of department or kind of head like maths lead or something, you can think a lot about the kind of curriculum and like how you can support that, and then sort of okay, well, what like um also what kind of like knowledge about learning do people need as well, and like how might that um help them make better decisions, and kind of how does that feed into professional development. I think my kind of sense reading it was probably if you're a primary school teacher reading this, and you've thought a bit about maths teaching, then it's probably like little snippets you're picking. I think, okay, well, I hadn't really quite thought about that in that way. That's like a slightly different thing, but I knew this and I knew that and I knew that. Whereas I think actually for like, if you're a school leader and you're trying to support parents, I definitely had conversations with like friends who say like, oh, there's so much on phonics. I get so much support with like supporting children on how to read. And I know what to do with that, but I don't really know what I can do to support them with maths. And actually, like school leaders sort of saying, what can I say to parents to support them with early maths? And actually, there's some really like small things here that you can say, like you're probably doing this already, just do it a bit more. Or okay, they can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but do they know at the end when they've counted the sixth one? Do they know that's six? Like, and if not, just start saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got six things. Like really like simple stuff that is probably really obvious to like particularly early years, I guess, teachers, but actually maybe at a kind of like more senior level or like policymakers and things like that, and certainly for secondary school teachers, I think there's a lot that's quite new in there, and thinking about where that's come from and where the gaps might be, and then also the kind of like the parallels, I think is really really useful.
Maybe I'll make that be a guide for parents, and I'll run it past you, John, before see if it matches up with what you have in in mind. You know, I like that idea that it gets more and more rich for the reader, depending on what level of the sort of school ecosystem they're operating within. You know, I think I've got 2025 in brackets on mine. This was like February time, was it, or thereabouts? I don't know.
Something like that. Yeah, it's definitely this year. Yeah.
So it's like it's hot off the press, but it's accessible. It is full to the brim. I mean, I've got 48-page version. Not all 48 pages have got sort of prose on them, but it's one that if you spent a term reading it, I think it'd be a lot of benefits. So obviously, I'll make sure all the links are shared, and this it seemed to be freely accessible, which is always a bonus with research of this magnitude. So yeah, so I think definitely worth reading. And we've only really touched the surface in this chat. But all I said to do is say thank you very much for joining me, John. It's been an absolute pleasure as always.
Great. Thanks for having me, Kieran. It's been great to talk about it.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.